Does Zizek become the greater obstacle, the larger number of followers he has? In the case of Socrates, we have one-on-one discussions and discussions with several people where, however, in the dialectic, as with, for example, Socrates and the interlocutors in the Politeia, although there are several interlocutors, there must be kind of defile where only one speaks to one and then one speaks to another. So there's never a polyphony or polyphony, many-voiced exchange, which has clear logical significance. It may have significance in some sense in the Platonic discussions when you have something like, for instance, in the beginning of the Republic, there's an exchange between several persons in the walls going towards the Piraeus, and that does have some significance. But where you have a dialogic discussion that builds towards bringing doxa or opinion from the level of doxa opinion up to the level of truth, you only have the one-to-one discussions. Whereas in the case of Zizek, you have certain things that are said, and then a crowd, a mass, a mania of persons supports this, not as a political party, but as a crowd which feels that maybe because they have a general leftist proclivity, and then they think whose fulfills the wants of the intellect best. So, I mean, for instance, that Zizek is guarded doesn't make necessarily direct assertions which are without any caveat. It's often many maybes, many perhaps as many admissions to see a certain point, but to not think it's the last word on that point. Many careful saving clauses, despite everything which is said about Zizek as being more direct than Jacques Derrida, or more direct than some his famous and most favored sort of punching bag, I think, on this is Judith Butler on this score of something like a endless series of saving clauses of the one may perhaps venture to say something about the transcendental so far as one admit that one is in an historical context whereby the interpretation of the transcendental cannot be given simpliciter as a interpretation of Immanuel Kant as a representative of the first to raise his head at the gate of the German idealism, has situated the notion of the transcendental, but one must realize that one has been distanced from this, and therefore that the approach to it is merely an interpretation, which, however, will remain questionable in the light of further Versuch, or further attempt to reach the essence of the matter, and so on and so forth. So, yes, so maybe Zizek has dialed back on that, but nonetheless, it's clear that the intellect demands something more than is given in the standard, as it were, political discussion. And so this is what distinguishes thinking, theory, philosophy, questioning from politics in a certain sense. That it more favors those who have intellect and have the demands requisite to the intellect first and foremost before them, but then, as I will attest, since I see no greater force of intellect in Zizek than I do in Alexander Dugin, since I don't differentiate between the right and left so far as my agenda, I therefore don't see, I don't choose Zizek specifically ahead of Dugin, except that I'm more willing to criticize Mr. Zizek because I think, one, he stands for the supreme power. Now, the classical liberal or rational enlightenment power, as signified by his commitment to Hegel, as signified by his commitment to, in fact, I would say to Freud, which might seem funny because people think, in the light of the criticism of Daniel Dennett or someone like that, that Freud is merely subjective. But indeed, Freud is the first great student of Ernst Haeckel, who was the promulgator and the most powerful exponent of Darwin in the German-speaking realms. So that Freud is a kind of practitioner of a form of hard scientism. And he tried to interpret everything, including those things which could not be given an immediate physiological etiology, to the sources of that could be brought into the empirical model. So that, for instance, when we try to investigate the psyche, the Rorschach tests, our attempt to give an empirical and repeatable, testable basis to the psychoanalytic realm in terms of a psychological test. So there's not that much. I mean, psychoanalysis means the talk therapy, and psychiatry means somebody with a medical background who tries to deal with these things that don't have, strictly speaking, physiological etiology so far as we know. And then psychology is this sort of intermediary position, which is usually given as the investigation of the individual rather than the sociology, the investigation of the group, or something like that. But in any case, Freud has attempted to do something which is reined in by a specific tact, by a specific way of approaching the notion of what is knowledge, a kind of Kraft-Ebing or sort of empiricism as understood within the is-ought. Actually, scratch that. I won't say that. I say empiricism as understood from the dogmatic claim that some people. Actually, scratch that again. I don't like the word dogmatic because it sounds depreciatory, but rather the claim that some people are trained technicians who are able to accept or not accept data in a way that's responsible, in a way that lives up to the high standards of a Wissenschaft, or the kind of which gives insight to human beings. So that the empiricism of a Kraft-Ebing and a Jung and a Freud Um, in fact, again, let's scratch that again. Let's say Jung had this empirical background, whereas Freud had a stronger notion of the superiority of the English in the form of Darwin's claim of what took over the so-called how do they call it? Newton called himself a philosopher of history. Is that the right word? Sorry, a natural philosopher of nature, whereas biology historically was understood as natural history. So you have this 2,000-year-old split between the so-called natural philosophy and natural history, which means taking the intellect, natural philosophy, taking the intellect, the pure intellect, dealing with numbers, math, to what comes forward by itself, the movement of the physical bodies on a ramp, as in Galileo's experiments, or in the sky, as far as the astrology is concerned. Or, on the other hand, physical history, which means the movement of the senses, the movement of this datum which comes from the senses. So you look, you see a bird behaving in a certain way, you report that, and that's the part of natural history. So Freud moves more within the classical tradition, whereas Jung moves more within this negotiation of what counts as facticity, what counts as an observation which can be accepted by a community. And so therefore Jung is a little bit more philosophical. But if you go out of all that and you simply give philosophy not a fixed rule boundary, then you come into these open questions which stand about the whole field of Zizek and Dugin, the whole field of right and left. And ultimately we want to look for a kind of investigator who is willing to do this thing which is Leo Strauss described as bringing forward the unpleasant data, the data that they don't like. But I would go further and say we want the investigator that doesn't even distinguish so much from not in a hard way, because they don't really know the results of it. They're not emotionally deeply entrenched in saying this is the bad data and this is the good data, because they don't know how it all plays out. We want these investigators that can stand in more freedom. So that's where I would place Heidegger. Now, Heidegger delivers treaties rather than dialectic discussions, and then one could say, is it Heidegger supported because there's a certain political faction that supports him? That would be the question, which would compare to what I started with does Zizek only support it because he has a leftist, specifically 21st century leftist kind of fad in history, which may be in 30,000 years totally alien, following. So I give an example now more closely to show what I mean. So in something like 1905, there was something like the Pure Food Act in America, in the United States, and it had to do basically like people were putting some preservatives, but actually formaldehyde and some bad chemicals into food for the reason that around that time, around the debut de Cecile, there was this increased profit margin for people who were shipping foodstuffs from long distance, because there were so many more people living in cities than had been, and therefore food was there was much longer distance, as we hear today, between farm and table, or however you want to put it. But clearly, formaldehyde is kind of bad to have in food, and it can kill you, and so it was an unhealthy situation, so the law was passed. So then Zizek is saying there's like three reasons that there'll be a movement which could potentially lead to passing a law. One is the material reason, like it's actually bad, or medically bad, let's say. So actually means just like medically, which is somehow our physical health is the thing that's the most obviously corresponds to the agathon, or the good, as an analogy already in Plato. But so it's a physical health issue, or it's somehow a tangible issue. Or two, it's an advertising issue, which points to these kind of Rousseau reasons, which are that the human being is the kind of creature that when it's in society, it's all the time thinking about superior and inferior, better and worse. And then it's like if you have the so-called pure food, then you're smarter, you're better, you're more attractive to the opposite sex, and you're to be preferred in every way, you're superior. Because you have the bon pensée, or the orthodox, the right view of the matter. And then Zizek says, oh, then there's this third category where they appeal to simply your own self-experience of the issue, and this is somehow to him the most degenerate and Artun position. So the Zizek's like a Nazi in this sense. He said these are the things which we're just deluding ourselves on. They're just a degenerate desire for some kind of fake experience of how did they put it? Sort of private transcendence, or something which is not really valuable, but it's just passed off as valuable in order to opiate the masses or whatnot. So his example, so that's my example, is the Food Act, which I think, 1905 Food Act, which I think is more or less, in hindsight, maybe it's clear, like you could try to pretend this Zizek analysis that, oh, people were only for the Food Act, and some people probably were only because they got a kick out of it. But on the other hand, it's clear there was the tangible issue with the formaldehyde and so forth. But Zizek puts this for the organic food. Well, of course, this was some time ago, but I think it becomes clearer as we go on that if you think of these, I think one of the big companies is called Monsanto's, and these other companies, you find out there is what Zizek doesn't mention, and so he doesn't speak directly to reason. Instead, that's why I wonder he speaks to his audience, which likes this stuff. He doesn't say, well, but this and that. He does often, but in this case, he enjoys his superimposing his idea onto the organic food issue. He says, do you really think those half-rotten apples are healthier for you? So, but then that ignores that there's a real issue where